How do you stand for science? We're talking about hormones in the endocrine system. Thanks to Sam Moyle for producing this PowerPoint. So our science understands we're going to look at the endocrine system releases hormones through amino acid derivatives, peptides, proteins, or steroids. Hormones travel to target sites via the blood, and hormones can alter the metabolism of target cells, tissues, or organs. Hormones belong to the endocrine system. The endocrine system produces and releases hormones into the circulatory system. Hormones are chemicals. They're secreted by the endocrine glands, which are located in various places around the body, and different hormones are released by different glands, and these chemicals are released directly into the bloodstream. So why use the blood? Because blood goes everywhere. All your cells need to be nourished by substances that are contained within the blood. So we have a large circulatory system that sends blood all around the body to every cell, or near every cell, so that every cell gets the requirements that it needs and also can get rid of its waste products. So the endocrine system is a communication system that communicates through the circulatory system using chemicals. So just restating that, circulatory system is the way that substances get to your cells and also to get waste out of your cells and away from your cells. So there's the heart, which is the main organ that does the pumping. Then we have a system of blood vessels such as arteries, capillaries, and veins, and arterioles and venules as well. All your cells in your body get washed over with tissue fluid that comes from the capillaries. And hormones can be in that tissue fluid so it can visit cells, particular types of cells. So let's have a look at how hormones work. So capillaries are leaky. There's the cells that make up capillaries are loosely held together. So there's little gaps that tissue fluid can escape from. Tissue fluid is basically just the plasma that is carried in the blood, the watery part of blood. Some proteins are too big to be able to make their way through, so they stay in the plasma. Some proteins are able to make their way through to the cells in their tissue fluid. Small water-soluble substances like your sodium ions, potassium ions, glucose, amino acids, they're small enough that they can pass through the gaps, so then they can wash over the cells. It'd be, your cells need to get glucose, for example. Some small stuff like oxygen, carbon dioxide just diffuses straight through. So the capillaries are leaky, tissue fluid escapes from the capillaries, and that washes over your cells and delivers what they need. And that includes things like hormones. So the way hormones work is they're secreted, and cells have specific receptors for specific hormones. So a hormone will only work on a cell if it has the receptor for that hormone. Some hormones are water-soluble, so they act upon membrane receptors, and some are lipid-soluble steroid hormones. They pass through the cell membrane and into the cytoplasm, and then they're picked up by receptors in the cytoplasm. Target cells make up target tissue, and target tissue makes up target organs. So thyroid-stimulating hormone, which is released from the pituitary, for example, that acts only upon the thyroid gland. It's not going to work upon the muscle cells in your legs. Hormones are released in small concentrations, but they don't need to have large concentrations, because once they've acted upon a receptor, they can then be released and go on to another cell. So the concentration of hormone is pretty small. We talked about this previously. Hormones tend to be long-lasting in their effects. So hormones are involved in long-term regulation of things like growth, reproduction, and blood glucose levels. All of these are acting over a long period of time. They also take longer to have an effect. Adrenaline is an exception to this. It works really, really quickly and has reasonably short-term effects. Most hormones we think of things that are having long-term effects in the body. Hormones are chemicals that travel through the bloodstream. They take longer to act, but they have long-lasting effects. These are things that we need to know about hormones. Hormones come in different forms. They're produced by endocrine glands, and there's two main groups of hormones. There's the lipid or steroid hormones, and they're all derived from a compound called cholesterol, which we get from our diet. They're fat-soluble, and they're associated with the adrenal medulla or the sex glands. The adrenal medulla is part of the adrenal gland which sits on top of the kidneys. In terms of naming, these end with on or ol, so testosterone or cortisol. So they are lipid and steroid hormones. Hormones can also be derived from amino acids, so they can be proteins. An example of amino acid hormones, there's amines, which are derived from tyrosine, which is an amino acid, peptide hormones, protein, and glycoprotein hormones as well. So here's a table from your textbook, page 143. It talks about several different types of hormone over here. So we've got amino acid hormones, peptide hormones, protein hormones, steroid hormones, and it's got some examples of these. So it's a good idea to have a look at these. You don't need to memorize these, but it's a good idea to know that there are several different hormone types. They're produced in different places, and they have different effects on different parts of the body. Hormones act on target cells, and target cells make up target tissue, and target tissue makes up target organs. Target cells have receptors that are specific to the hormone that is going to have an effect on them. Usually receptors are proteins on the cell membrane, or they are proteins in the cytoplasm. And because they're proteins, they're encoded for by DNA. Steroid hormones go through the cytoplasm, through the cell membrane. So the question is, why can they go through the cell membrane? The reason for that is they have long non-polar sections, and since the cell membrane is mostly non-polar, it's easy for them to make their way through. Water-soluble hormones tend to bind on membrane receptors. It's very hard for water-soluble proteins to get through the cell membrane because it has that large nonpolar area, and if it's water-soluble, it's going to be a fairly polar molecule. As I said before, target cells make up target tissue and target organs. So as we said before, thyroid-stimulating hormone really only works on the thyroid gland. It's released from the pituitary, which is a small gland in the brain, but it only works on one part of the body. So there would be cells in the thyroid that make up thyroid tissue, and lots of thyroid tissues together make up the thyroid gland. So here's some examples of those two types. So here's our steroid hormone. It is passing through the cell membrane, and then we have our receptor present in the cytoplasm. So we make a complex there, and then when that happens, we get, in this case, we're getting some genes being turned on, and we're getting a particular new protein being produced. So this is changing what the cell is doing. We're altering the cell metabolism. We're running a particular chemical reaction, which is leading to this new protein being produced. Over here we have a water-soluble hormone, so we've got epinephrine, which is another word for adrenaline. Its receptor is sitting in the cell membrane. Once it bumps into that receptor, that changes the function of the receptor, and we get some chemical reactions happening. So we've got GTP turning into GTP, which is leading to a conversion of ATP into CAMP, which leads to AMP being released. So this is all metabolism stuff. We're changing the chemical reactions which are occurring inside the cell because that receptor has been activated by the hormone docking with the active site on the receptor. So how do we get a hormone being released? So it could be triggered for release by nerves or other hormonal messages. So we get a stimulus leading a response, and a response often is targeted by nerves, and that can trigger a gland to release a hormone. So adrenal glands sit on top of the kidney, and they're stimulated to release adrenaline, which acts on blood vessels, which causes them to dilate. Intestinal blood vessels constrict, redirecting blood flow around the body, and cardiac muscle increasing the heart rate. But the action of turning on the adrenal glands to release adrenaline is caused by a nervous response. So this is nervous. We could have a hormonal system that does the same thing. So a hormone being released triggers another hormone. So thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, which is again in your brain, that stimulates the thyroid stimulating hormone from the pituitary, which then works on the thyroid gland in the neck to release thyroxine. And we're going to look at what thyroxine and adrenaline do in a lot more detail a bit later on. But here we have a hormone stimulating the release of a hormone, which leads to an action, a response. So let's do our check. So the endocrine system releases hormones, which are amino acid derivatives, peptides, proteins, or steroids. Hormones travel to target sites via the blood, and hormones alter the metabolism of target cells, tissues, or organs. Okay, Flipping Science, we looked at the endocrine system. That's it for Flipping Science today. See ya.